Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel where we comment, we discuss, we talk about, and we analyze the game of chess. And in this video, I'm going to show to you a game I played yesterday at the Queen Chess Club as part of the ongoing Amateur Two-Team Championship. Excuse me, Two-Player Team Championship to be exact. And first, we're going to see the announcement of the tournament. I'm going to share it with you. As you see here, it's called the QCC Mini Queen Chess Club Amateur Two-Player Team Championship, meaning there are teams consisting of 2 players each competing against each other. And it takes place on 4 consecutive Fridays. Round 1 was January 9th. Round 2 was January 16th. I started with a loss in the first round and a win in the second round. And I'm going to show to you the game from round number 3, yesterday night, the 23rd. And it's going to be one more round on January 30th. Time control. It's because it's 4 rounds for Swiss. Time control is G90 D45. What does this mean? It means that when the game starts, players have 90 minutes on their clocks, 1.5 hours. And when it's your time to move, when it's your turn, meaning after the opponent has completed their move, for the first 5 seconds, the clock does not move. And then it continues going downwards, and players need to complete all their moves before the clock shows 000. Because if it does, no matter how great your position, you are timed out. Who was my opponent yesterday night? His name is George Dippel. As you see here, he has a rating of 1700. And let's compare this with my rating. My rating officially is 1551. After the December Swiss, in a few days, it will increase to 1631. But either way or other, I'm below the 1700. So George was, I would say, the favorite, but the difference is not that big, the slight favorite. George had the white pieces, I get the black. And we're moving now to the chessboard of chess.com to see what exactly happened. I'm going to enter the moves one by one, and you're going to see them on the chessboard, how the chessboard looks after every move. And the computer is going to express its quote-unquote opinion, meaning what the stock fees quote-unquote think about it. If you see a positive number, it means white, George is doing better. A negative number means that myself, Harry, myself, having a better position. Of course, the number is going to tell you how better, how worse is the position for each of us. And for every move, there's going to be a comment. If you see 2 exclamation points, that's the best, meaning the move is brilliant. 1 exclamation move means that the move is great. A star means it's the best. A check mark means that, excuse me, a thumbs up means it is an excellent move. A check mark means it's a good. And on the negative side, if you see question mark with exclamation point, the move is inaccuracy. Question mark's a mistake, and 2 question marks, it is a blunder. But let's start and see how did the game start. It starts usually with book moves. You'll see a little booklet after the move. And George starts by sending his pawn to d4. You're going to see the little book here. d4 is a book move. And we'll continue with a few book moves in the beginning. I play the symmetric way, pawn to d5. For the white first move, the most popular is pawn goes to e4 or pawn goes to d4, followed by pawn going to c4 or knight to f3, and occasionally pawn going to g3. So George was one of the 2 most popular. In my reply, if white starts with pawn to d4, black will either send the pawn to d5, the symmetric variation, or sometimes the knight to f6. And some players may play other a little bit less common moves, pawn to c6 or pawn to e6 or who knows what. Second move. George sends his pawn to c4. This is a usual more common move after the pawn goes to d4. And I reply, in this case, the most common move for black is pawn to e6, but I send my pawn to e6. And this is called the Slav defense. You see the name here. Why do I play this move? Two reasons. First is I don't want to block my bishop on c8, although as you'll see later, I'll force to do it a few moves later. And second is that since most people with black will play pawn to e6, there is some chance that my white may not be prepared for the second move, or less prepared. Third move for George is knight goes to c3. Control of the square d5 and the pawn clearly, and I'm going to defend it with my knight going to f6. Next move, George develops the other knight to f3. And now, as I told you before, as I have to block my bishop on c8 by moving the pawn on e6. Why did I do it? I don't want to lose the pawn on d5, and there is a danger of queen going to b3. If queen goes to b3, then I could have simultaneously pawn to b7 under danger and the pawn on d5. By keeping my bishop on c8 and sending my pawn to e6, I avoid this. I don't want to start with losing a pawn or having to compromise to keep my pawn. Compromise means if I take first, then they double my pawns. We finished the first 4 moves and everything is theory until now, book moves as they call them. Move number 5 for George, he sent his bishop to f4. Computer thinks it is a mistake and would rather have the pawn to e3, but I understand George, because if you put your pawn to e3, you block your bishop on c1. And bishop to f4 controls a lot of important squares. e5, d6, c7, b8. How did they reply? I send my bishop to d6. Why? I want to exchange bishops. Because I don't like his bishop on f4 controlling all these crucial squares. If the bishop stays there, this will hinder my development and will make many of my possible combinations later impossible. Possible, many combinations I would have in my mind that will work, otherwise impossible, because I'll have a piece of mind being taken. But computer doesn't like it. Would rather have me take the pawn on c4. It's difficult to keep the pawn on c4 if I take it, because George can send his pawn to e3. I might be able to attack it with to defend it with pawn to b5, but I weaken myself a lot. Although this is playable, I need to tell you, it is playable. Now, this is called the semi-Slav defense up to this point. Computer thinks a miss, and after 5 moves, computer thinks that George is doing better, not too much, 0.46. Let's see how game continues. George decides to exchange the bishops. Although computer would rather have his bishop going to g5 and pin my knight. I would have to be careful about this pin. Definitely I should not touch the knight on f6, it's pinned, because the moment I touch it, I have to play it, and the moment I play it, I lose my queen. But this did not happen. Queen to d6. And now George sends his pawn to e3. Now that's not blocking his bishop any longer. And for me, kingside castling or sword castling. We change now d5. He takes on d5 with the c4 pawn. I decided to reply with the e6, where I have 4 choices. Clearly, I'm not going to take with the queen because I'm going to lose my queen from the knight. If I take with the knight, and I did this many times in the past, but I was told that then pawn to e4 and I have to move my knight again, I give more space to my opponent, not a good idea. So it is between the c and the e pawns. If I take with the c pawn, then I give my opponent the option to send the knight to b5, I attack my queen, and if I'm not careful, knight can even go to c7 and capture my rook. To avoid any such scenarios, even though there are defenses against this, but in order not to have to defend against them, I take with the e-pawn and also liberate my bishop on c8. Bishop to d3 for George, that starts thinking about the h7 square. If you can put queen, bishop, and in this diagonal, the knight on g5, the pawn on h6, or at least the control of the h6 square is his. And he has an entry point. Of course, this doesn't mean that much, one entry point by itself, but I'd rather not have him start these things than myself having to defend later. And that's why I send my pawn to h6. Even though the computer would rather have my bishop go to g4 and pin his knight. The problem with this pin is that this is temporary. Then queen goes to g2. If I exchange here, I open the g file for him. He hasn't castled yet, so he can castle queenside anytime he wants. If I don't castle, I already gave him two forces to attack on h7. And all that remains is for the knight to go to g5. And George now was afraid of me pinning his knight. That's why he sent his pawn to h3. This means that my bishop on c8 doesn't have too many squares to go. Most likely it's d7 and e6. And the problem with any of them is white queen goes to b3, attacks my pawn on b7. I decide, forget about the bishop for now, send my rook to e8, pin the pawn on e3. Develop my rook, now has control of at least the two squares e5 and d4. And we'll think later what to do about my light color bishop. We continue the first 10 moves and George is ahead by 0.34. Let's see how game continues. George castles kingside. And now I'm thinking, how did you develop? I have three pieces, rook a8, knight b8, bishop c8 that have not moved at all. Compare this with George that has only his rook on a1 that is on the original square. And the queen on d1, yes. Myself have three pieces blocking each other, so I need to do something. What is the something? I don't want to send my knight to a6 because then George can exchange and double my pawns on the a file. So I send my knight to d7, temporarily blocks the bishop on c8, but hopefully I can remove it later. And in any case, my bishop, as I mentioned, doesn't have too many squares to go. Queen to c2 for George, no surprise. He threatens h7 twice. Of course, he defended twice by knight f6 and king g8, but this makes my knight on f6 unable to move. In fact, what can he move? If it goes to h7, it's lost immediately. I decide to send my other knight to f8 to have better control of h7 and also open the diagonal for a bishop on c8. And as I say, a knight on f8 means no mate. Because here, queen and bishop were the other way around, I might have to worry about it, but not now. Rook to c1 for George, that he's thinking about the c6 pawn, how to attack it. And I helped him, of course, inadvertently, because since my bishop cannot do too much along the diagonal c8, h3, why not fianchetto it, ascending on the long diagonal, pawn to b6. But this weakens my pawn on c6. It's attacked twice by queen and rook, defended only by my queen. And the only thing that saves my pawn is that there's a knight on c3. But the moment that the knight on c3 moves, the pawn on c6 will be precarious. And George will send his knight on e5, attacks the pawn on c6 once again. And of course, I'm defending it and developing my bishop on c8, sending it to b7. Fianchetto then controls, not controls, but exerts pressure on the long diagonal that goes from a8 to h1. Queen to e2 for George, that decides to change the diagonal for the queen. My rook goes to c8. I want to share control of the semi-open c file. It's called semi-open because there's a black pawn on c6, but no white pawn. Ideally, rooks want open files, but if they cannot find, then currently there's no open file. The semi-open ones, where there are pawns of only one color, is the second best option. And George doesn't like my fianchetto's bishop controlling the long diagonal. That's why he sends his bishop on a6. I have two choices: either exchange or send either my rook or my queen on the 7th rank to defend the bishop, or even send the bishop. No, I cannot send the bishop to a8 because then I lose the exchange. But if I just defend the bishop, I was afraid I would have to worry about one of my pieces doing nothing else than defending the bishop, meaning unable to participate in anything else. And after a lot of thought, I decided best choice, exchange the bishops. And not only that, George's queen is a little bit offside at the edge of the board. Most queens can go very fast anywhere, but at least for one move, the queen is on a6. But it's attacking my pawn on a7. I need to do something about it, because if I lose it, then the pawn on b6 is in danger. And before I know it, I'm giving George the chance to have a wonderful passed A pawn. That is why I send my rook to C7. George is afraid I'll send my queen to B4, and really I was thinking about it. Then I attack the pawn on B2. That's why he sends his pawn to A3. My knight goes to E4 now. I want my knight to be on George's half of the board. Until now, George already has a queen and a knight on my half. So why not place my knight on E4? And if queen goes back to, for example, D3, then my knight is blocking the diagonal. Although now without light color bishop, George cannot be so hopeful about the diagonal hit before from B1 to H7. George sends his queen back to E2 since he cannot take the pawn on A7. Queen has to go to more important square. And I decide to exchange the knights. If it stays here, then George can exchange whenever it's good for him. And then my pawn on E4 is, I would say, sensitive, blocked by most of the other white pieces. So I'm taking on C3. George decides to take with the rook instead of the pawn. That's what the computer thinks the best move. And now I see an opportunity to advance my c-pawn. Why? Because George cannot take it with his pawn because he loses the knight, cannot take it with his rook, he loses the rook. And so my pawn can go, what can I call it, safely to c5, and then next square goes to c4, and then it is, believe it or not, not yet a passed pawn because of b2, but is near becoming a passed pawn protected by the d5. We completed the first 20 moves, as you've seen, and little by little, things started going my side, but very slowly. I'm ahead by only 0.08, which basically means nothing. Material is the same. And another measure I have to see how good the position, but it's not accurate at all, is how many times each of us controls the center. I do this usually when my opponent is thinking about their move to see who is better. When my opponent is moving, is thinking, excuse me, how to move, two things I have in my mind is one, what would happen if all pieces disappear and only kings and pawns remain? The reason I'm doing so is to see if it's good for me or bad to exchange the pieces. And the other one is how many times the four central squares are controlled by each side. For the white, for George, he has one with the d4 pawn, second with the e3 pawn, third, and that's it. Let's give a look. 1, 2, the rook does not, the queen does not, the knight does not. On my side, the pawn on c5, the pawn on d5 too, the queen on d6 controls d5, and the rook on e8 controls e5. So I have 4 versus 2 for George. Of course, this is very inaccurate. What good is it to control the center if your opponent has back rank mate next move? Oh, he's going to win a heavy piece. But let's continue after the 20 moves. The game is still a big fight. We are very near each other. George doubles his rook on the, excuse me, his rook's on the c file, yes. The idea is if he can put his knight somewhere safely, then he can start taking on c5 and starts entering my position through the c file. But I'm sending my pawn to c4, so I'm telling George, you can move your knight anywhere you like, but the c file is not yours, because no matter how he takes, then my pawn on d5 will take back. In theory, he could send his pawn to b3, but he does so, he loses his pawn on a3 if he wants to fight for the c4 square. And George decides to, if he cannot do anything here, he decides, let's fight along the king side, send the pawn to e4 to attack the pawn on d5. Computer says it's inaccuracy, and until now the game was more or less even. But now computer thinks it's an inaccuracy, and I'm ahead by 1.27. Not winning yet, but really starting things going my way. But will it continue that way? When I saw it, I realized I had the chance to win the e4 pawn as follows. After I double-checked that things are this way, I sent my pawn to f6. Why? Attacking the knight, and no matter where the knight goes, then the knight doesn't have too many squares. f3 in g4, then my rook takes the e4 pawn. But did I miss anything? Well, George decides to let me get the knight, but he sets a nasty trap. Queen to h5, meaning if I take the knight, he takes my rook on e8, and he's ahead by an exchange. This caught me a little bit by surprise, but I knew that the moment I moved my rook to safety, then he had to move his knight. I don't think he could attack anything else. And the pawn on e4 would be mine. Fortunately, I did not fall for that. Rook goes to e7, is safe, gives extra protection to the g7 pawn. And George decides, let's exchange the knight since his knight is in a precarious situation, not too many squares to go. And then I could also attack the queen. I mean, he could put it to g4 or f3, then my pawn goes to g6, attacks. Oh, the queen can go to h6, but then the rook can go to h7. But he doesn't want to enter this kind of worries because really this would give him a big worry. So he thinks the best thing is exchange the knights. If I don't exchange them, of course, I have a knight of his on g6. That's not good idea at all. And that's why I decided to exchange the knights. Computer thinks the best move, and of course, he takes it back with the queen, nothing else to do. And now I take the pawn on e4. Computer thinks it's a great move. You see the exclamation point, a little bit less than brilliant. But for me, it was something I'd planned many moves ago, so it's not anything that spectacular. I didn't think it was anything great. Just the result of four-move combination. We completed the first 25 moves, as you see. I'm ahead by 1.92. Things started going my way, but will they stay my way? If you remember in the previous video, although this was against a chessboard, I had a completely winning position and I ended up with a stalemate. So I have to be very, very careful. No upsets, no surprises. Just continues really setting, I wouldn't call it a trap, but a nasty case, meaning a dangerous case. His rook goes to g3, which means that if I'm not careful, meaning if I move my rook from c7 and send it anywhere other than 7th rank, he's going to checkmate me. Although the computer says it's inaccuracy, but really, if you're done, what are you going to do? You're going to try to set as many traps as you can, hoping your opponent will fall for one of them. I send my rook to e7 now. I want to double along the e file that now is open, completely open. Joe's afraid I'm going to check and exchange rooks. That's why he's going to send his king to h2 because I'm ahead by a pawn. And what George does not want is for me to start exchanging everything until I have a passed pawn and I win. So king goes to h2, which helps him avoid a check, but his rook on g3 is pinned. There is something else just to tell you, in case any of you may be wondering, doesn't, let me say, put it back. Doesn't George have a free pawn on h6 because of the pin? No, because then I take his rook on g3, and if he takes it back, I win the queen, and I have an extra rook. And now a chance for me to win a second pawn on d4. Now, at this point, until now, I had an extra pawn, but no passed pawn. But now look at that. My pawn on d5 is a passed pawn, meaning if everything disappears, meaning if queens and rooks could fly off the board from both sides, then my d4 pawn would win it, especially the king being so far away on h2. Perhaps the king might be in what's called the square, meaning if the d5 pawn was allowed, the white king could stop it, but I would use my ABC pawns to create connected pass pawns. This means if my A and B are exchanged with George's Y, A and B, then C and D are connected pass pawns and they easily win. But this is a long way ahead. George now is going to send his rook to E1. And he's setting a trap. He's giving me a free rook. But if my rook on E7 takes his rook, then queen goes to G7, is checkmate. It is a very, very nasty trap. In the middle of the game, when all the emotions run amok, as they say, and you're so excited that things are going your way and you're going to win, because I didn't know I was ahead by 3.08, but I knew that I was better. If I take the rook, next move, George is going to checkmate me. If I send my rook to D7, C7, D7, for example, he has at least a perpetual, because queen goes to E8 check, king to H7, queen to G6 check, and at least he escapes with the draw. But I had seen this in advance. Otherwise, I would never have taken the D4 pawn. I see it, and the move I play is my rook goes to E4. George is going to send his rook to D1 to attack my D5 square that is relatively weak, is protected only by the queen. And perhaps if he could send his queen on F5 or H5, he might win that pawn. And if he wins this pawn, this is my pass pawn, don't forget. And I decided to send my rook on E2. First of all, I was a little bit nervous. Unnecessarily was proved later. I was afraid that he had a trap to take my rook, and if my pawn takes back, then he wins my queen. But I had my rook on E7. That was not possible. But during the game, I had not seen it, believe it or not. I thought that George had set a trap for me. And in any case, what I did was not a bad move. It is only I had an unnecessary worry. I sent my rook to E2, and I attacked two of his pawns, B2 and F2. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy. But I felt, first of all, I avoided a non-real danger, but also I'm threatening two pawns. If he defends one, I win the other, and I'm 3 pawns ahead. But still, I need to worry about G7 no matter what. But George will relieve me of this worry by sending his queen on F5, but he's doing it not to relieve me of the worry. Once again, queen cannot take on H6 because I take the rook, he takes back, and I win the queen. But he's attacking my pawn on D5 twice, plus threatening with a queen on a C8 check. I don't think he would have a perpetual. He might if he could play again twice. No. If he play queen to C8, I would put my rook on E8 and there is no perpetual. But in any case, I think let's start exchanging now. I'm ahead by 2 pawns. Queen to E5. We completed the first 30 moves. I'm ahead by 3.70. Although I reached the 4 point something a few moves ago, but still I have a nice, comfortable lead. But I'm 2 pawns ahead in material. But George found a way to get one of these back. This caught me by surprise. Rook to D5, and now I knew it. I cannot take the rook because then I lose my queen. So let's exchange queens. 1 point ahead, not so good like 2 pawns ahead, but still, I thought that I cannot take the second pawn no matter what. So at least let's go to a winning ending. So we're exchanging now. Great moves as a computer, yes. What else could I do? I'm a pawn ahead, the winning position, exchange the queens to be near the end, not have to worry again about the G7 mate. And now for me, let's get another pawn. So now I'm 2 pawns ahead once again. Take on B2. But George wants to take one pawn back, takes a pawn on F6, taking advantage of the pin. One pawn is my advantage, but look what a pawn. The pawn on c4 that needs 3 squares for promotion. And what do? I don't want to push the pawn. What I want to do is protect it from behind with the rook. When you have passed pawns, the best way to protect, or at least one of the best, is put the rook behind. Not in the front because it blocks the promotion square. If you can put it in the back, that's great. And for the side that defends against it, if they can put the rook on the back, it's the best way to attack the pawn. That's why I put my rook first, so George cannot put any of his rooks on the c5. And definitely not the f6 to c6. The other one, he can put it from g6 to, from g3 to c3, but ideally you want your rook behind the pawn, not in front of it. George decides to fight against his pawn, so he puts his pawn back to, actually, not his pawn. His rook to f3, doesn't have to worry about it, because now he cannot even put his rook from g3 to c3, because then there is no pin, and I win his rook. I want to defend my pawn even better than just a rook behind, because what if he puts two rooks in front of it? So pawn goes to b5. So now he can put everything that he has in the c3 square or the c file, and still he cannot win the pawn, or at least not without losing a rook. He decides to bring his king near the pawn to fight. King goes to d1. And I decided to start pushing the ABC pawns, hoping to have two pass pawns, connected pass pawns if possible. After we exchange with the A pawn, pawn goes to A5. And we completed 35 moves, and I'm ahead by 4.72. At this point, I could feel I was winning. There is no queen for perpetuals or for nasty checkmate surprises. Of course, I don't have back rank issues. George's pawns are still second or third rank, too far away from promotion, and I was feeling that it was very difficult for him to fight back. But let's see what happened. King goes to f1. And my pawn goes to b4. I want to change along the to change the a pawns, because then I have corrected pass pawns. What can George do? If he does nothing, I take on a3. If he pushes to a4, then a4 and a5 cancel each other, and I still have the b4 c4 connected pass pawns. He decides to exchange. I exchange, and now once again I have b4 c4 connected pass pawns. No chance that his a pawn suddenly out of nowhere can find its way to promotion. Meaning, if, for example, any of his rooks could take my pawn on a5, and then the a4 pawn suddenly gets promoted before you know what's happening. George decides to send his king near the action to a1. My pawn goes to c3. Cannot take the pawn, because although he has two rooks attacking it and it's defended twice, if he takes it once, then my pawn on b4 will take his rook. He sends his king to d1 to try to stop my pawn, but a little bit too late. Pawn goes to c2, check. And now let's see what's happening. Until now, I had advantage of 7.23, and now I am m9. If I play correctly in 9 moves, I'm checkmating. How did I do? Because don't forget, in the one of my games against the chessbot, I had m3 or m2, and it was a stalemate in the end. My pawn goes to c2, and of course, during the game, I was thinking about it. I was thinking, Harry, no stalemate, be careful. Pawn goes to c2, check. Of course, stalemate is almost impossible for George, because he has two rooks and three pawns. Even though two of his pawns are blocked, it's almost impossible for him not to have an illegal move. This is a check now. What can George do? If he's how many illegal moves does he have? If he goes, by the way, it's m5 is a computer. I didn't know it at that game. Meaning, if I play perfectly in 5 moves, I'm mating. Let's count George's legal moves. e1, pawn goes to c1 mate. If it goes to c1, rook to b1 check, king goes to d2, pawn goes to c1 check with a queen, and then I have an extra queen. If king goes to d2 or e2, pawn goes once again to c1, discover check, I have an extra queen. So at this point, after 39 moves, George resigned. And George, he fought very well. I think he fought very well. Basically, it's one inaccuracy when he moved his pawn to e4 that decided the game. Other than that, he really fought well. He set some nasty traps to me, at least twice. Once I could have lost exchange, and the other I would have been checkmated if I just grabbed his rook on e1. He fought until the end, a very good fight. And let's see what does the computer think. Let's give a look at the review. George had accuracy 85.2. That's very good. And I had 96.7. I hope people don't start being suspicious because 96.7, I doubt I ever had it. Too near perfection. And our rating, George played as if his rating was 2250, which is a very high rating, well above both of us. And I played as if my rating was 2500 Grandmaster level. Of course, as I've told you, not trusting these numbers, they are usually too flattering. And as I've mentioned, I don't need this kind of flattering. Let's see the categories. No brilliancies, great. One for George, two for me. Book for each of us. Best 20 versus 12 for me. Excellent 9 versus 6 for George. Good 7 versus 6 for George. Inaccuracies 5 for George, 1 for me. And one mistake for George. That's what the computer has to say. And at this point, we completed 3 rounds. And there is one more round remaining on January 30th. And we are going to show you this game after it's completed a week from now. And they've started the tournament with 2 wins and 1 loss. And given the fact that all 3 of my opponents had higher ratings than me, I think it's quite successful. In the meantime, what else do we have? The next video I'm planning to be one more chess puzzle, and then we continue with the chess boards. Now we are the advanced boards of rating 1500. Thanks everybody for viewing. Thanks for watching these videos. Thanks for to the subscribers. If you have not yet subscribed, all you need to do is click the button. Thanks to the likes and the comments. This is a Greco Chess YouTube channel. I'm Harilos Aniziris, and for now, goodbye.